If you've ever read a logical reasoning question, thought you got it right, you picked your answer confidently and still got it wrong, it's not because you're bad at logic. It's not because you overthink things. It's because the LSAT is designed to trick smart people. It gives you just enough to feel like you're on the right track, then it pulls the rug out from under you with one subtle twist. So today, I want to walk you through the real ways top scorers beat logical reasoning. Not with random hacks, not by guessing better, but by training themselves to spot patterns that most students never even notice. Let's talk about one of the LSAT's favorite tricks, the weird situation trap. Here's how it works. They give you a strange or surprising observation, something that doesn't quite add up, and then they immediately jump to an overly confident conclusion to explain it. For example, people in region A get less sleep than people in region B, but report more energy during the day. Then the conclusion goes, therefore, sleep must not affect energy levels. Okay, hold up. On the surface, that might feel logical, but look closer. The conclusion here is assuming that sleep is the only thing that could explain energy levels, and it assumes that self-reported energy levels are even a reliable measure in the first place. What if region A has stronger coffee? What if they're younger? What if they just think they're more energetic, but they aren't? This is the classic curious fact pattern. You're presented with an unexpected result, like less sleep, more energy, and then you're pushed toward a conclusion that pretends to explain it completely. But here's the key insight. Anytime you see the LSAT using a surprising statistic, a contradiction, or an unexpected result to support a conclusion, your red flag should go up. Why? Because weird results equal sloppy logic almost every single time. So how do you beat this? You don't need to disprove the conclusion. You just need to undermine the logic they use to get there. And here are 3 go-to questions that'll help you do just that. The first is asking if something else could explain this. This is where you generate alternate explanations, like other factors. Maybe region A has better diets, or more sunshine, or a cultural tendency to exaggerate. The more alternatives you can think of, the weaker the conclusion becomes. The second question to ask yourself is if cause and effect could be reversed. What if it's not that less sleep leads to more energy, but instead, people who feel more energetic tend to sleep less? This kind of reversal is a common LSAT trap. They show you a pattern, then they jump to which direction the cause is moving without having the evidence to back it up. The third question to ask yourself is if both things might be caused by something else entirely. This is what's called a third variable. Maybe a different factor is affecting both sleep and energy, like stress levels or even how the data was collected. Now let's go one layer deeper. The language they use matters. When you see phrases like must be the reason, therefore the only explanation, or this proves that, that's your cue. The LSAT is locking in one possible explanation, and they are ignoring every other possibility. And that's where you strike. Even if the conclusion sounds reasonable, even if it feels right, remember this. The LSAT isn't testing whether the conclusion is true or not. It's testing whether the argument for it makes sense. And that is a big difference. So here's how I recommend that you practice this. Grab a whole bunch of strengthen and weaken questions that use weird data or unexpected results. Every time you see one, ask those 3 questions. Is there another explanation? Could cause and effect be reversed? Or is there a third hidden factor? If you can do that automatically, you will start to spot this trap in seconds. And once you see it, it loses all its power. You go from confused and second guessing to being confident and in control, and that is how top scorers think. Now let's talk about assumption questions. These are the silent killers in logical reasoning. They may not look scary, but they can destroy your score if you don't know how to approach them. Now, when most students hear the word assumption, they start thinking to themselves, oh, this must be something the author believes to be true. Not quite. On the LSAT, An assumption is something that has to be true in order for the argument to work. In other words, if the necessary assumption turns out to be false, the whole argument falls apart. And the best way to find that assumption is by using what I call the new idea test. Here is the basic idea. You start by asking, what is in the conclusion that wasn't already in the evidence? That is the new idea, and that is where the gap is. That is the exact space where assumptions hide. So let's break it down with a simple example. Suppose you had an argument where the premise is, this new medication reduced symptoms in 80% of participants in a short-term study. The conclusion is, therefore, it should be approved for use by the general population. Now let's pause. What is new in the conclusion? We went from a small, short-term study to approval for everyone. That is a big jump. So, what assumption is the author making? Something like, what worked in the small study will work for the broader population, or it's safe and effective long-term, not just short-term. Those are the gaps the conclusion is glossing over. So, how do you test whether you found the right assumption? You use the negation test. Here's how it works. You take the assumption and you flip it by making it false. So if the assumption is, this drug works just as well for the general population, you negate it by saying, this drug does not work well for the general population. Now you ask yourself, does the conclusion still make sense? Nope, it crumbles. If the drug doesn't work for most people, there is no way we should approve it for widespread use. So we found a necessary assumption. This is so powerful once you get it, because now you're not picking the answer that sounds the smartest or the most technical, you're picking the one that the argument literally depends upon to survive. Now let me give you one more way this shows up that throws off a lot of people. Sometimes the conclusion introduces a value judgment, something like, we should implement this policy, or this product is the best option, or this proposal is fair. Those are all loaded with assumptions. If the author says, we should implement this policy, they're assuming things like, it won't have major side effects, it's better than alternatives, or it's feasible given our budget or constraints. Those assumptions are not in the stimulus, but they're crucial to the conclusion. And that's where wrong answers love to hide, right outside the spotlight. They might add new facts or nice-sounding ideas, but they don't actually bridge the gap. That's why your job is to find the lead, the shift, the wait, hold on moment. Once you train yourself to spot those new ideas, necessary assumption questions become way more predictable. Now, one more thing. Don't fall for choices that might feel true. This is where strong test takers get burned. You read a choice and think to yourself, yeah, that makes sense. That could be true. But the LSAT isn't asking what could be true. It's asking what must be true in order for this argument to hold up. And that is a totally different game. So, when in doubt, go back to the new idea. What did they introduce in the conclusion that didn't show up earlier? That is the gap, that is the assumption, and that is your answer. Now let's talk about flaw questions. Here's why I love them. They are predictable. The LSAT doesn't reinvent the wheel every single time. It's not trying to catch you with brand new logic tricks you've never seen before. It's testing the same exact patterns again and again and again. Once you learn how to spot these patterns, you stop feeling lost and you start recognizing arguments like, oh, I know this one, they're doing that thing again. Let me show you what I mean. The first big flaw I want to talk about is necessary versus sufficient, confusing conditions. You've probably heard this one before, but most students still fall for it when the LSAT dresses it up. Here's the classic version. If it rains, the streets will be wet. The streets are wet, so therefore it must have rained. Nope, not necessarily. Maybe someone washed their car. Maybe a pipe burst. Maybe the sprinklers went off. This is the LSAT flipping the direction of a conditional statement. They take a sufficient condition and treat it like it's necessary. And if you don't catch it, it might feel airtight, but it's not. So when you see a conclusion drawn from a condition being met, ask yourself, did they confuse if and only if? Or is this a one-way street or a two-way assumption? Because if they're acting like the rule works both ways without proving it, you've got your flaw. The second big flaw is part versus whole. And this one is sneaky. It might go like this. This basketball team is the best in the league, so every player must be elite. Really? Have you ever seen a team carried by one superstar and a bunch of role players? The flaw here is assuming that's what's true of the whole must be true of each individual part. And of course, it works the other way too. This particular employee is underperforming, so the whole company must be doing poorly. That is assuming the part defines the whole. The LSAT loves this because it sounds reasonable, but you've got to take a step back and ask yourself, is the argument moving too quickly between individuals and groups? If so, that's your cue. Part to whole or whole to part is in play. The third big flaw is correlation causation, and this is the LSAT's greatest hit. You'll see it everywhere. For example, ever since this new law was passed, crime rates have dropped. So, the law must have caused the drop. But maybe something else changed at the same time. So here's the test. Did the author observe two things happening together and then immediately assume that one caused the other? If so, it's a correlation causation jump. And the LSAT wants you to say, wait, could this just be a coincidence? They might even admit it was just a pattern, but still make the causal leap. And here's the twist. Sometimes the flaw is not just assuming a cause, it's assuming the only cause. Because X happened after Y, Y must be the reason. But not so fast. Ask yourself, could both X and Y be caused by something else? Or maybe, could X have caused Y, or is the timing just a coincidence? That doubt is your angle. Now, how do you use this in real time? When you hit a flaw question, do the following before reading the choices. First, pause. Then ask yourself, what is wrong with this argument? Then, try to name the flaw in plain English. Seriously. Say it out loud like you're explaining it to a friend. This argument assumes one event caused the other just because they happened together. Or, they're acting like the whole team's success proves every player is amazing. That's what I call flaw labeling, and it's a game changer. Why? Because now, when you go into the answer choices, you already know what you're looking for. Instead of reading 5 confusing options and trying to figure out which one sounds right, you're scanning for the one that matches your diagnosis. And 9 times out of 10, you'll spot it faster than someone who just read it straight through. One more advanced tip here I wanted to share with you is that flaws are often baked into the structure of the argument, not the content. That means don't get distracted by the subject. The question might be about politics, health, economics, cats. It doesn't matter. What matters is how the flaw is supported, not what the argument is about. So when you see a new topic, don't panic. Just ask yourself, did they skip a logical step? Did they assume something without proof? And did they ignore alternative explanations? If the answer is yes, you've found your flaw. And this process is how you go from feeling overwhelmed to being the person who can spot the issue in seconds and then move on confidently. It's not about memorizing 100 different flaws. It's about getting fluent in the top 5 or 6 that the LSAT loves to test most often. Because once you know those cold, you'll start recognizing them on sight like catching a typo in a sentence. Now let's shift gears and talk about a question type that might seem straightforward, but is secretly brutal if you don't know the rules. Must be true questions. I know the name sounds simple. You've got to choose the one that must be true based on the stimulus. And that's exactly where most people mess up. Because the LSAT wants you to think must be true means choose the one that sounds reasonable or seems likely, but that's not what they're asking. The right answer in must be true isn't just reasonable, it's 100% provable, directly supported by what you just read. If there's even a tiny leap in logic, if they add a small idea, or they stretch what was said just a little bit, it's wrong. Let me say that again. In must be true questions, if you can't underline the exact part of the stimulus that backs up the answer choice, it's out. Now here's the trap. The LSAT will intentionally write answers that sound good. They might match your real-world knowledge. They'll feel like they fit the tone of the passage, but they'll be unsupported. Let me show you an example. Suppose the argument, aka the stimulus, says, all doctors are professionals. Some professionals are writers. That's it. Now imagine a choice says, some doctors are writers. That might sound reasonable. We all know some doctors write books. But does this stimulus prove it? Not even close. You're given two facts here. All doctors fall under the umbrella of professionals, and some professionals are writers. But that doesn't tell you anything about whether the groups overlap. Some on the LSAT means at least one. It could be a completely separate slice of the professional pie. So even though it sounds good, it's a trap. The LSAT is baiting you with real-world logic, and you have to ignore it. So what does a correct must-be-true answer look like? Usually, it's a restatement of the stimulus in slightly different words, or a valid inference based on conditional logic or quantified statements like all, most, and some. Or it could be a simple combination of two ideas from the stimulus, nothing extra, nothing flashy. The right answer will often feel boring or obvious, and that's how you know it's right. So here's how to train for this. First, you've got to read the stimulus slowly. Underline your quantifier words like all, some, none, most, at least one, exactly three, and pay attention to conditional language like if X then Y. Also note relationships or overlaps and pivot words like however, despite, nevertheless. These often signal where the test is building tension. Then ask yourself, what is the tightest conclusion I can draw from this? And I don't mean here what sounds good. I mean, what is the safest, most airtight sentence I could write that is guaranteed to be true given only this info? That is your internal filter. And then, when you hit the answer choices, look for violations. Any of the following red flags should mean immediate elimination. If there is a new concept or a new term that didn't appear in the stimulus. If there is language that is stronger than the stimulus supports, like saying all instead of some. Or if there is real-world logic that sounds right but isn't provable from the passage. Now, most students go into must-be-true questions thinking, which answer sounds good? But top scorers go in thinking, which answer is provable without adding anything new? That shift changes everything. When you start training yourself to think like a lawyer, not a trivia contestant, these questions stop feeling tricky. You stop falling for traps, and you start spotting airtight logic in 30 seconds flat. Now let's talk about parallel reasoning questions. This is the LSAT at its most annoying. Not because it's tricky, but because it's time-consuming if you approach it the wrong way. Most people see parallel reasoning questions and immediately groan. 5 long answer choices, all of them wordy, all looking incredibly similar, but just different enough to make you second-guess everything. But the good news is that parallel reasoning questions are beatable. Once you know what to ignore and what to zoom in on, they become way faster and more predictable. But first, let's break down what a parallel question is actually testing. It's not testing whether you understand the topic, it's testing whether you can match the structure of the reasoning. That's it. If the original argument uses a conditional statement and flips it in the conclusion, the right answer will do the same kind of flip, maybe with a totally different topic. If the original argument jumps from a small sample to a broad generalization, the right answer will jump in the exact same way. So here is your golden rule. Ignore the topic and match the skeleton. Let me show you how this plays out. Suppose the argument in the stimulus says, all turtles are reptiles, Franklin is a reptile, therefore Franklin is a turtle. That might sound okay if you're skimming, but replay that. This is a conditional error. Specifically, it's reversing the conditional. Just because all turtles are reptiles doesn't mean that all reptiles are turtles. Franklin being a reptile doesn't mean anything or prove anything about whether he's a turtle. So in the choices, what are we looking for? We want another argument that also reverses a conditional. Doesn't matter what it's about topic-wise. It could be cars, birds, yoga classes. We don't care about the topic. We're looking for the same flawed move. So maybe the correct answer will say, all architects are designers. Sam is a designer, therefore Sam is an architect. Boom. Same logical structure, different topic. That is your answer. Now, the question, of course, is how do you do this fast? First, you want to ID the conclusion. Ask yourself, what is the author trying to prove? Because that's what the choices are going to try to match. Then you want to ID the evidence, namely what supports the conclusion. Is it a conditional, a comparison, a generalization? Then you map the logic. Now here's what I recommend. Say the structure out loud, but strip out the nouns. So if the argument is all A's are B's, C is B, therefore C is A, you say they reversed a conditional, or they confused a necessary condition for a sufficient condition. That is your structure and that is what you're matching. Then you go to the choices and eliminate aggressively. Don't read every single word, look for the conclusion and look for the structure. Ask yourself, does this follow the same type of reasoning? Or is it just similar in topic, but different in logic? If it's the latter, you want to knock it out fast. Now here's a pro tip that separates top scorers. Don't diagram everything. That is what most students do, and it slows them down. Instead, ask yourself, can I describe the argument in plain English? Like, this argument assumes that because two things are related, one caused the other. Or, this argument confuses some with all. Or, this argument reverses the logic in the evidence. If you can say that clearly, you don't need symbols. You just need to scan the choices for something that follows the same flawed thinking. Now, parallels, remember, are not about what the argument says, it's about how the argument moves. Think of the argument like a dance. You're not matching the outfits, you're matching the steps. Does the argument take a small example and blow it up into a sweeping conclusion? That's what the right answer should do also. If it relies on conditional logic and then twists it around, find the answer that makes the same exact twist. Once you stop focusing on the surface level details and start focusing on the reasoning patterns, you'll stop dreading these questions too. So this is how you beat logical reasoning, not with tricks, not with guesswork, but with pattern recognition. Structure over story. Every question has a blueprint, and every wrong answer has a tell. Your job is to train your brain to see both. Once you can do that, the test gets simpler and your score will go up. And your confidence? That's the real win. That's it. Let's get back to work.